Welcome to the Business Talk, a global podcast series that highlights distinguished faculty members and their impactful scholarly contributions. I'm Deepak, your host from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. Raiford as our distinguished guest on Business Talk today. Before we get started, I would like to introduce today's guest. Dr. Raiford Guins is a professor and chair of cinema and media studies in the Media School at Indiana University Bloomington and an adjunct professor in the Luddy School of Informatics, Computing and Engineering. He is a cultural historian fascinated by the material lives of technological artifacts, how they are designed, commercialized, used, discarded, and preserved. His object-centered research has led him from exhibiting Atari's discarded games in a landfill to studying artifacts in museum, collections, and exhibitions. His scholarship moves across design history, the history and philosophy of technology, and material culture studies, reflecting an intentionally undisciplined intellectual style. This approach was shaped by his training in the 90s at the University of Leeds with British intellectuals associated with the experimental journal Blog, who practiced a distinctive form of cultural studies within an art history department. In today's episode, Dr. Raiford Guins joins us to unpack the central ideas from his fascinating book, King PONG, How Atari Bounced Across Markets to Make Millions. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Raiford Guins to the conversation. Professor Raiford, it's a distinct privilege to welcome you to Business Talk. We are grateful to
Great.
you for accepting our invitation.
Great. Thank you. It's wonderful to be here. I really look forward to the conversation. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Professor. Professor King Pong opens up with the claim that an unassuming game helped establish an entire industry. How does Dr. Yun argue that Pong in particular reshaped consumers' relationship with technology far beyond the arcade?
One thing that kind of surprised me with doing this book, it's sort of emboldened me to make claims that we have Atari to thank for the fact that games are everywhere today. That was never a statement I set out to sort of achieve or even to really consider in much detail, but it's just something that sort of dawned on me the deeper I got into this particular company's history. And here's some background in terms of how I've arrived at that sort of claim. One of the significant things that even before Atari, that Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney, the founders of the company Atari, they worked for a company called Nutty and Associates, and they developed the first mass-produced video game called Computer Space. And the influence, if not the excitement for doing this, came from observing and playing the game Space War on a mini computer at Stanford's Artificial Intelligence Lab. I think from what I've seen in oral histories, Nolan Bushnell was blown away by it. Ted Dabney was sort of, huh, but it seemed kind of a fun type of endeavor. So when they were working for Ampex, they were in the video file division, and they were kind of in part-time, after work on the weekends, playing around with trying to make a consumer version of this. And later in the interview, I will kind of explain what consumer means in the coin-op amusement industry. But they were trying to imagine a version that they could kind of make a buck off of, right? Institutional computer games were played at research institutions, right? They were not for general public. Basically, faculty and students pursuing electrical engineering, physics degrees, computer science would have access to these types of games. So it's too expensive to make a consumer version by using mini computer technology, right? You're looking at thousands and thousands of dollars. So eventually they were able to create sort of a translated version of what they saw executed on mini computer architecture for the coin-op industry. And that was Computer Space. And they were able to kind of replicate it using a lot of television technology at the time. So that's one important shift is the kind of innovative idea was to take something done for a very kind of exclusive audience at research institutions and then make it marketable to kind of mass produce it for everyday players. Okay, that to me is such an overlooked significant moment in the history of games. And I think that's the first step towards today's ubiquity, right? Is getting it out of these kind of privileged spaces into a consumer market. I think the next step we see is working with Nutty and Associates that has an infrastructure of distribution, advertising. It's part of a 100 at that time in the late 60s. It's part of a 100-year-old industry called coin-operated amusements, right? Going back to the 19th century. So they released a new product and an infrastructure that existed, right? They learned lessons and then they were able to do Pong initially, another coin-op game that, as we will spend time talking today, did incredibly well. But after that, they then partnered with Sears in 75 to start bringing what they've done for the public institution around coin-op games into the home. So they've leaped into the consumer market, consumer electronics, right? And I think that's part of the kind of that's the backstory on the everywhere-ness of video games. And I think even in 1974, if I recall correctly, Business Week, the Wall Street Journal, and Time Magazine all had feature stories that this new medium called video games are everywhere. And that's only like a year and a half after Atari launched Pong. So I kind of look at a lot of, I guess you would say, this is kind of leading up to the fact that we can play games in our browsers, on our Apple Watches, on game consoles, on Steam, on PC, on mobile devices now. Atari had this idea of just trying to explode the market for games where anywhere can be a gaming opportunity.
Professor, the book looks closely at product positioning and category creation. How would you describe Atari's strategy for positioning Pong within the existing amusement industry? And what made that positioning so radically different?
Okay. So here's a bit of a historical lesson, if you will. And I have to share this because I feel, so many of us are just unaware of this, right? The coin-op industry was organized in a very particular way. And let's all be aware that when I'm referring to coin-op amusements, that's a subdivision in a much larger industry called vending, right? Putting coins into machines to buy cigarettes, right? To make phone calls, well, that's no longer the case these days, right? But, so many different services and goods we could acquire through mechanical machines, right? So there's that part of this. And the way that the coin-op amusement industry was organized, you had manufacturers. So these are companies mostly based in Chicago. So Chicago Coin, Gottlieb, Bally, and then Atari and Nutty and Associates on the West Coast, right? So a manufacturer makes a product that gets sold to distributors. And this reflects on my point I made earlier. Those are the consumers of coin-op products, distributors, not us. The everyday person putting coinage into a machine, we're not considered the consumers. We're the users, we're the players, right? But the reason that all of the marketing is done is to entice distributors to purchase a product from a manufacturer. The distributor then rents or sells the machine to an operator. The operator puts the product into a market, so a bar, a restaurant, an arcade, a recreation center. And usually they do a split with the owner of that location, 50-50, 60-40, right? So that's sort of the financial ecosystem of coin-op amusements at that time, right? So 60s, early 70s. So a manufacturer like Atari is then marketing, promoting, advertising, selling to distributors who will then place the game in a local market. So here's the interesting thing that Atari did. And this was something that I think was really exciting for the book. And there's so many backstories to this, as I think we'll cover in the other questions, is that Atari adopted a very particular concept for how it understood its products and how it attempted to position its products on the market. And that concept is one word, sophistication. And it has two meanings for Atari, though. The first meaning is state-of-the-art technology, technology that could be considered innovative, right? Advanced, unlike anything, the guys in Chicago are doing at that time. Because the industry, up until the launch of computer space and then a year later, Pong, was primarily pinball machines, large, bulky electromechanical machines that you would have like a guns, steering wheels, light guns, this type of stuff. You'd have like torpedo games. You'd have a periscope turning around to launch rockets, right? A lot of mimetic controls. You also had shuffleboard. You'd have like bowling games you'd play, these types of things, right? But the idea of associating sophistication with technologies that one, Atari is leading with a new type of product in an existing market. It's cutting edge, it's ahead of the time, it's sophisticated in that it doesn't look nor is the insides like any other game on the market. So there's that side of it. I think also Atari can claim this sense of technological innovation based on the fact they're located in a region that's just been named Silicon Valley, at that point in time in the early 70s. So it's kind of drawing on what's happening in their local demographic as a way of sort of planting a flag in terms of innovation. So there's that side of the story. The other meaning, and this is the meaning I find to be most interesting in terms of thinking of marketing strategies, is that Atari's idea of sophistication applied to the actual design of its products, the look, the shape, the form of its products. And, to kind of appreciate this, you have to one and kind of envision or at least, Google what the original Atari Pong looked like. You have wood veneer sides. It's a very short cabinet with a flat top. One word is on the bezel. It's a bright yellow bezel. You have matte cardboard, then you have a 13-inch television screen. The laptop I'm talking to you right now on is a 13-inch screen as well, just to give you a sense of scale, right? So this machine was not ostentatious. It was not garish. It didn't have a lot of graphics and details. It was also quiet compared to the kind of clang of pinball. One thing I like to point out is that it took up less space. When you play sorry, too many pins here, pinball, you have a very large play field, and the body adds extra space onto that in order to play the game properly, right? Pong, you can stand relatively close. It's short. You can put a drink on top, right? You can put it into a corner. So it's really made for kind of a variety of different spaces. And that's the key sort of ingredient with this use of sophistication because it didn't look like other amusement products. Hey, it could work in a game room, a recreation center, an arcade, but it also could access spaces where those types of machines designed for those spaces never could. And this was the key to unlocking the door to new markets for Atari. It's that hotels, bars, cocktail lounges, universities and student unions, right? Any place became a viable location for these sophisticated products that Atari was pushing out. So it appealed to traditional markets like arcades and amusement sites, but also so-called developmental or emerging markets. And Atari was that driving force to kind of have these new markets emerge. So its products look good in a variety of different spaces. It could easily kind of fit into existing kind of ambiances that different locations would have. And the key here for me is I've tried to reduce this sense of sophistication into a very simple equation. More locations equal more profits. And I think that was really how Atari kind of launched the first year, the first fiscal year. It was 3 million in profit. Estimations for the next fiscal year were between something like 10 and 12 million dollars. So clearly, this new product, because it could gain access to so many more markets, it broadened where profits could be had in the context of an industry. Also, something Atari did, and I think this is by 1974, so the company's been into existence for 2 years now. Because of this concept for marketing around sophistication, it actually completely changed the way that coin-operated amusements are perceived. The industry itself, I think my hardcore proof for this is when I get old copies of trade magazines, they always smell like cigarettes, right? It seems to be many kind of classify it very stereotypically as kind of a sleazy industry. There's often connotations like mobsters being involved. Atari rebranded by 1974. They no longer even saw themselves as kind of in the business of coin-op amusements. They became innovative leisure. They completely kind of put a new spin on what their product lines would be and how they could be understood. And I think that's a way of elevating their brand, but also elevating the industry of coin-op amusements into kind of a different level altogether. Their products and their company and what they're doing and being kind of state-of-the-art, cutting-edge technologically, they are an entirely different company compared to all of those other companies still making the likes of pinball and other types of coin-operated games.
Professor Pong is now playable everywhere, from browser version to mobile apps, and even the Apple Watch. How does King Pong trace their journey from a single arcade cabinet in 1972 to a game that circulates across so many contemporary platforms?
Right. This is my kind of prehistory, sort of stuff that I was sharing with you earlier. Um, I think the way that I've tried to put this together is that if Atari only stayed in the business of developing equipment, that was often a common term, equipment for the coin-op industry, the best it could do, the best it could achieve would be to have every distributor worldwide, buy its product. That's it. Okay. That would be the kind of upper echelon of success. But pivoting to consumer electronics and starting to target the home is an entirely different industry, an entirely different demographic. So in that sense, Atari is covering two spaces, public gameplay and private gameplay, in terms of what one can do in their domestic environment, right? What's interesting for me, you've got those spaces covered, okay? But Atari did something in the realm of the public that I think is how I've tried to draw that line to today's kind of ubiquitous nature of gaming. Nolan Bushnell shared a beautiful phrase with me when I was researching a book that came out before King Pong called Atari Design. We met in Santa Monica. I've interviewed him, I think, 3 or 4 times now. And he said that he always understood what Atari was doing as, this is a nice phrase, harvesting vacant time. So he said that to me, and it's like the microphone drops, right, when he ushers this statement. I thought, okay, what the hell does that mean? Actually, can you kind of unpack that beautiful expression? And what he kind of shared with me, and we had a lovely conversation about it, because I was so excited because I thought you're actually validating a lot of the thoughts I've had about what you've achieved and what your company was doing. But the examples he shared with me is any place where we have to wait, any place where, he gave the example of pizza, and we know that Bushnell went on to do Pizza Time Theaters, aka Chuck E. Cheese, the idea of having to wait for pizza. Hey, that's time to get people up, dropping coins or tokens into video games. So even before that initiative happened with Pizza Time Theater, his company was already kind of positioned around this notion. So here's some of the interesting products, and this is why I really tout Atari as kind of that ground zero for ubiquitous gaming. It's that they had this system called the kiosk system. It was a series of 6 little triangular games that could fit together. Okay. If you don't have room for all 6, you get one of the little wedges and put it in the corner of your hotel, right? When all 6 were kind of joined together, they reached out and collaborated with the Bay Area Rapid Transit System, BART, in San Francisco. And they positioned these kiosk games on platforms where commuters would change trains. So here's a moment of harvesting time, right? You're waiting for your train, there's a train delay. You have time to drop a quarter in. It's a small investment, right? In case your train comes and you have to leave. So what, right? So that space of commuters waiting in a routine, something banal, something everyday, there's that example. They also introduced cocktail table cabinets. So the idea here is that we're making packaging. That's how I refer to Atari's cabinets. They have a form of packaging for cocktail tables. This is aimed at posh cocktail lounges, taverns, bars, restaurants, right? You can sit down, you have a glass cover on the machine, and you can put your beverage, and often they would have ashtrays connected as well. You could have a smoke, you could have a drink, and you could play a game simultaneously. So there's another market where they are customizing their packaging for these spaces. In the early 70s, they also introduced specific packaging for pediatrician's office. That was Puppy Pong. Dr. Pong was for kind of doctor offices. These games were set on free play, and they were just there so that people could pass the time waiting to be seen by a doctor. Other innovative examples, just 2 more I'll share. There's this really little known coin op game called Two Game Module. And it's very innovative in that your standard upright, it's one screen and you face it, one person plays, or you can play doubles. But this machine actually had 2 different games, one on each side. So the game, you would have a screen here and then a screen there. 2 different players opposite one another could play 2 different games. And I interviewed the industrial designer for the book as well, but I asked, Nolan Bushnell, where did you imagine that? that game, right? You can see it would be difficult because it has two screens on opposite ends to place it in an arcade or even a bar unless it goes flat against the wall. His response was airports. And I have to say that kind of blew my mind at that moment when he mentioned that. This machine came out in 76. You think of all the traffic moving inside airports. You can put this against the wall. Two people can stand, on one end, not disrupting the traffic flow. And I think about that. I was just flying back to Indiana and I went through LAX. And there is a new company that has a chain of arcades in 17 different US airports, right? You can play console games, PC games. They have these little retro plug and play games you can play. And I thought, man, this is Bushnell's idea right here, right? You're waiting for planes. You pay by the hour. You buy a day pass for $50 in case your plane has like a 8 hour delay or something like that, and you play games. So again, that idea of harvesting. The fourth example I will share with you. This was sort of released in 79, and I think this new kind of form of packaging existed only for some of Atari's top games. An example I will give you is Asteroids. Asteroids was Atari's all-time best-selling coin op game. But it wasn't just the game that kind of recouped those sales. It was the packaging that allowed that to happen. Because that game worked across three different packaging formats. Your standard upright for arcades, game rooms, I would say shopping malls, many places became more open to coin-op games, as the industry proved so lucrative. Cocktail tables. So you could have a sit-down version of Asteroids. You could maybe play in restaurants. They introduced a third packaging called the Cabaret. The Cabaret was much smaller, very slender. And the reasons for doing this, I think, are absolutely fascinating. The first is there were no details. I mean, sorry, no graphics, none of the kind of artwork around it, just had side kind of wood veneer panels, a very small attraction panel. So there's nothing like lit up, screaming the name of the game with kind of expressive topography or imagery or anything like that. So the idea is that wherever space is a premium, a lot of the marketing material mentioned hotel lobbies, right? Department stores, which I thought very interesting, not shopping malls, but department stores themselves, right? And the last connector, in addition to kind of low-key design, not disruptive to ambiances, the last key factor was that, and this is the one that kind of I thought, man, Atari was thinking so far ahead. The idea here was that those people who played Pong in 72, by 79, 80, 81, 82, they're older. They may still play games, but they don't want to play in arcades where a lot of young kids are, right? And I thought Atari's actually tracking an aging demographic and they're creating packaging formats to appeal to that demographic. So I think all of this innovativeness, if we only think about technology, we miss all of this, right? We miss the importance, on one hand, of design. We also miss their kind of savvy understanding of markets and in making products to fit into markets, but also expanding markets.
Professor is someone who literally excavated the Atari landfill in New Mexico. How do you connect that archaeological encounter with Atari's discarded games to the business history? You tell about Pong as a market-making product.
Mhm. Yeah, I got really sick from the excavation. I didn't realize how filthy it was and how bad I stunk afterwards. This I'm going to applaud you for this question because you really made me kind of go back and try to think about how I can connect at least the last three books that I did. I think it's fair to say all of them have some type of emphasis on Atari in different ways, right? But the book Game After that I did, that came out in I think 2014. I had a very simple question, and I often like to do books with a simple question because these questions never prove to be simple, right? But I simply asked, what happens to games after we've played them? And I was very interested in sort of the life cycle of games and the afterlife cycle of games. So part of asking that question was that the kind of academic field of game studies tends to privilege play, and game development and design tends to privilege those areas, right? So if you think about it, we've only really kind of scraped the surface on two particular moments in terms of the overall life history of any game, right? Development, design, and play. But as anybody who's who's older and who's gone through a lot of different consoles over the years, where does this stuff go? So on one hand, I was interested in storage, neglect, basements, attics, closets. For a researcher, it's not easy to access those spaces. You just can't knock on somebody's door. Can I see your junk? It's not a viable way to do research, let's say. So storage meant archives. Storage also meant museum holdings, right? All of a sudden, I'm looking at museums who collect and exhibit, preserve, conserve games, right? So there's that side of it. Archives who make game hardware, software, documentation available to researchers. And of course, disposal. That's the landfill connection, is that I was trying to follow games when they're going through sort of stages in their careers when they're being so devalued, they're thrown out, right? Um, so we had one landfill that we could excavate, and that gave me a chance to think a little bit about waste, decay. Often that wear is never, just because the game is old doesn't mean it's kind of thrown into a landfill. Travel around to boardwalks, seasides, arcades you see in these spaces. There's old Miss Pac-Man machines, it seems to always be still functioning. There's still kind of commodities and products garnering quarters, right? Making money off of themselves, right? So I was interested in all of that. But here's where I start to switch into the next book. I kept seeing coin-op games in museums. I would see them displayed behind glass, right? And I would see a little title card that says Tato, 1978, Space Invaders. But here's the thing, I cannot know it as a game. I can't play it. It's designed to be played, it's designed to be interacted with, but yet I'm cut off from all of that. All I can do is look at it in this context. So my question was, what do I see? What's being shown to me? And Game After didn't answer that question. I had to do another book in order to get an answer to that. And the answer for me with Atari Design was that I'm seeing a history of design practices, not just electrical engineering, not just software development, not just hardware development, but I'm seeing graphic design, mechanical engineering, I'm seeing industrial design and interaction design. But yet museums do not tell me any of that, right? So this Atari Design set out to understand the design processes, right? To kind of examine the different design professions that led to the kind of the conceptualization and the design and production of Atari's coin-op products. I focused specifically on coin-op at that time. So I wanted to know, how does design shape the experience of play? That was my main question. So here comes King Pong. Both of those books, Game After and Atari Design, typically that scale of research takes 6 years. It's archival. I interviewed all of the surviving graphic designers, mechanical engineers, and industrial designers who worked at Atari. And that was really fun, to kind of hang out and get those stories. But I thought, where I realized, kind of based upon your question, was that King Pong, if Atari Design is looking at the design process, well, what's missing there is productization. And this is where King Pong came in. I thought, now I want to look at, well, how do you productize something, a concept, an idea? How do you productize it? Once you have it as a product, how do you market it? How do you advertise it, right? Like, how do you get it out into the world? Atari Design didn't really focus on that side of it. It was more about conceptualization, really trying to document that process of industrial design. It's like, why do my hands go here? Why did you use a trackball, not a button or joystick, right? I really wanted that kind of physical understanding. So this was, in my way, in my mind at least, King Pong is like a natural progression. If I'm mapping out all of these different phases that a product goes through, I guess King Pong was looking at how something becomes a product, how's it marketed, promoted. So the question then is, what's next? I think where I've been kind of negligent is the user experience. I haven't really kind of landed there yet. So that might be something for the future. Got it.
Professor King Pong is described as a business history as much as a media history. What does the book reveal about Atari's internal business practices, marketing, distribution partnership that helps explain why Pong succeed where other video games earlier did not?
I like this question too. I think I'm a fan of all of your questions. I like this one because it's really pushing the kind of business angle that I really wanted this book to focus on. And part of the reason for doing that is people often, game historians, the general public, and Atari itself, right, often celebrates the accomplishments as technological innovations. But for me, that's only part of the story. The full story is to also consider innovations in marketing. So with this question, what struck me about it was that one, Atari is it became synonymous with video games. It's branded, right? So even when the kind of famous Atari VCS came out, it was very common for young people to say, "Oh, I want an Atari," or "I have an Atari." Atari just became the word for video games, and you may have a different system like an Intellivision or something like that, or a ColecoVision, but Atari just became kind of the name for video games and video gaming. So there's that side of it. The brand became very synonymous with the phenomenon unto itself. When Atari pivoted to do consumer products, working with Sears, its brand was already established since 1972. So the idea of saying, hey, you can do what you do in public now at home. You can play Pong that you enjoyed in the arcades at home on your own kind of hardwired device, right? So the brand was easy to kind of move into different markets because it was established. And that's one of the reasons Sears wanted to partner with Atari. They were kind of regarded as the reigning king of the medium of video games, right? They invented it, was how Sears sort of looked at that. So that's one sort of side of this. But I think there are some really interesting kind of discrete factors that respond to your question best. My question that I asked of Atari was that, okay, you've got three engineers here. At that moment in June 1972, when Alan Alcorn is being asked to develop this kind of simple ball and paddle game that will become Pong, how do they know anything about business, right? How do they know anything about marketing? And that was a question that when I went back and started interviewing Bushnell and Alcorn again, my questions were very much centered on that notion, marketing. You guys are engineers. How did you know how to do this? And what I got a lot from them was, we're kind of making it up. We're taking risk. We're going to try anything. We're going to figure it out as we go. And I tell a lot about that process in the book itself. But for me, what I wanted to know, I wanted a better answer, I guess she would say, than that, right? And I found it. And it goes back to Dabney and Bushnell's time at Nutty and Associates. And this was a real crucial sort of part of the story that I think I've kind of brought to the front a little bit. Dave Ralston was the sales and marketing person at Nutty and Associates. And he was working with both Dabney and Bushnell around the marketing sales of computer space. And the coin-op industry at the time found computer space to be too complex. It was too difficult. It was too complicated of a game. And the industry would sort of, in trade magazines like Cashbox, for instance, Dave Ralston wrote this sort of op-ed piece, which I thought was fantastic because he was taking that attitude that computer space is complicated. It's too sophisticated was actually the word he used, right? And he actually spun that in such a clever way. The problem is not computer space is too sophisticated. It's that the existing coin-op amusement is decrepit. So he played that as a strength of the new product. So there's this happening, right? Sophistication is already a word in place at Nutty and Associates. When Bill Nutting, the owner of the company, was marketing and promoting and kind of talking about the kind of product before computer space, which was not a video game, it was a quiz machine called Computer Quiz. And this was a game based on intellect, right? You would have kind of trivia questions. So he imagined new markets for this kind of innovative type of electromechanical game. This is not pinball, so it's not going to follow in those spaces that pinball goes. It's going to go to student unions. It's going to be a presence at universities, right? In fact, some of their promotional material for that game listed on the front all the universities that Knowledge Computer appeared in, right? I'm sorry, Computer Quiz appeared in, right? So they're really touting different markets. And part of that was the way that Nutting kind of voiced an understanding of who would play this game. He says it would resonate with the computer generation. Now, this is the late 60s, keep in mind. We don't have microcomputers at home yet, right? So in a way, this is fabricated because the computer generation would be those young people pursuing computer engineering, computer science degrees, right? Not the general public whatsoever. So in a way, he spun that to make their product seem a little more sophisticated than pinball and also appealing to a different demographic and also being played at different locations. So Atari adopted that. In my mind, when Atari, some of the language it uses on its sell sheet for Pong, low-key design suitable for all locations, that's straight out of Nutting Associates. So I think because they don't have MBAs, they're not coming from a marketing business or advertising background, Bushnell had a model to hand. It's like this is what Nutting did. It seemed effective for its previous product. Ralston was doing an interesting job trying to kind of tout the sophisticated design development of and technological breakthroughs with computer space. So they adopted that as their own understanding. Two other ingredients were really important for some of the achievements and kind of some of the inside stuff that I've tried to kind of manifest for readers, right? Atari created kind of a dummy company called Key Games. And this was really an innovative sort of way of gaming the market of coin-op amusements in that a local market would be set up where a distributor buys from a manufacturer. And it's that manufacturer's games, that brand, that gets then kind of placed into local markets by way of the operator, right? So let's say if Atari's operating in a market and then one distributor is buying directly from Atari, another distributor is buying from a competitor. So Atari developed Key Games, which in reality was a subsidiary. But in terms of the public faciness of this, Atari positioned them as a competitor, right? Not affiliated with Atari whatsoever. And they would often kind of make jokes about, hey, we have legal on it, man. Those bastards down at Key are ripping our games off when it's a lot of the same engineers making the same games with slightly different packaging, right? But the reason Atari did that, this is kind of a ruse, is that they could then dominate markets. There would be two perceived competitive product lines, but they were actually owned by the same company. The same company was generating profits off of the appearance of two lines. So that got Atari's products under the Key kind of moniker. And of course, Atari, it got it into more marketplaces. Okay. Eventually, the companies folded back in as Atari. And this was very tricky to talk to both Bushnell and Alcorn about. Another important aspect of the success, and this is sort of almost dumb luck success. There's a lot of moments of serendipity in the history of Atari. Um, because Atari was so successful. So the handicap tavern sort of test, the play test of the game or the prototype happens in August. Atari goes into sales. Sorry, Pong starts selling in the state of California in November. So then move into early 1973. By then, there are already clone versions coming out. Um, a patent was not taken out for Pong. I've asked the surviving members of Atari, they didn't have time. They're making these machines as fast as they can to keep up the orders, right? They've got a real hot item on their hands, right? So other companies started knocking off Pong, making all of these different versions of paddle, ball and paddle games. Some of these versions came from employees stealing the printed circuit boards of Pong or kind of buying a machine, then kind of reverse engineering it. So you would find all these competitors that would have their versions of Pong. The only licensed one was Bally, and that was under the title of Winner. So what's important about this, and this is where it was a little sketchy, sort of raising this point with both Bushnell and Alcorn, was that from their point of view, these companies are taking profits out of their pockets, right? Back in 73, 74, right? But when I mentioned major news magazines by 74 already singing how successful this new medium is and how it's everywhere, Atari's total production run of Pong was between 7 and 8,000 total units. I don't think that claim of everywhere could actually be achieved with only that many products. Now, it's supposedly rumored, and I've seen some documentation. I use this same number in King Pong. I have some reliable sources have used the same number as well. That on total, in terms of all the Pong-like games, there were 45,000 manufactured, right? So what I'm getting to is this. Another reason Atari was successful is because of all of these clones, right? That these clones made the phenomenon of video gaming an everyday experience. I don't think just that production run of up to 8,000 units would have achieved that. So in a way, Atari benefited from all of these other companies trying to jump on its bandwagon. Also, it shows, and this is something Bushnell would kind of often celebrate, it shows that they are a leader in terms of product design because other companies are copying them. And that was another sign of their success.
Professor, when Atari moved from the arcade to the living room, it effectively helped invent the home video game market. How does the book narrate the transition from point of amusement to
Mhm.
consumer electronics? And what kind of risk or experiment does it highlight along the way?
This was the chapter in King Pong that I never originally intended to write. So I'm happy you asked the question about this because I wanted to just look at the late 60s up until about 74, just the coin op machine. Um, but at MIT, I think when the book was being kind of shopped through the channels of marketing and everyone else, the upstairs, as we like to say, a lot of people remembered having owned a home Pong. Oh, he should include that. That's part of this story. And they were right, 100%. But I wanted to tell that story in a different way. And here's why. Because a lot of Atari's history gets sort of dominated and dogged by Nolan Bushnell having seen a demo of the Magnavox Odyssey in Burlingame in 1972. So this was in 71, the Magnavox Odyssey comes out. And so, I mean, I always get my dates wrong here. But anyway, the point is that Bushnell saw Ralph Baer in the Magnavox Odyssey demo. This is the assignment it came out in 72. This is the assignment he tasked Al Alcorn, develop a tennis-like simulator, right? And it was based on what he saw. And a lot of the history gets caught up in all of this, like who was first, who was the inventor, who was the innovator. To be honest with you, that exhausts me. And I think for anyone who works on a history of technology, we don't want to privilege invention. We don't want to kind of privilege these competitions around inventors. We don't want to just rehash like a great man type of narrative. So for me, the distinguishing characteristic is this. Yes, the Magnavox Odyssey came out. It was a consumer electronic, a home video game in a market that didn't exist. Whereas when Pong launched, Pong was in a recognizable market that's over 100 years old. It had infrastructure. The Odyssey didn't, right? The Odyssey confused a lot of people. There was a misconception that you needed a Magnavox TV to play the Odyssey on. So I thought I'd rather tackle that story as two radically different industries. So when Atari decides to then move into consumer, this is actually a funny story. The story goes back to, I think it's August or July 73. Keep in mind, Atari started in June of 72. So about a year later, Nolan Bushnell as president, issues this, what did he call it? A charter for engineering. And it was like a list of different sort of ideas or kind of goals they needed to meet this next year. Like little things like change the coin boxes, right? Or introduce new packaging. I think at that time it was Puppy Pong and Dr. Pong, right? And hire somebody to organize the documentation of Atari's products, right? They're a new company, so they've had to grow so fast. There's certain things like documenting the industrial design process, right? So all of these points are there, but there's also this other little odd number. I think it was like number 6 on that charter, about putting together a PC or a color version for consumer Pong. Now, I pause there. Now, the rumor around this, and I think Alcorn and Bushnell still laugh at this, that was sent out, to which Al Alcorn reads this little line about consumer Pong, to which he responds with one word, no. And the point behind this, and this is the question about risk, that's an entirely different industry, right? Just a year ago, 3 engineers with no experience in business started manufacturing, marketing, selling their own products under the name Atari. Their business plan originally was just to produce games for manufacturers to build and sell. They wanted to be the kind of innovation behind games. They would develop them and sell them to manufacturers. But they decided Pong's proved such a good play test. They wanted to keep that profit for themselves. So they went in at a risk, All of a sudden, we're going to have to hire people. We're going to need spaces. We have to understand who's going to sell these games. How are we going to put them together? Where do we get the wood for the cabinets? All these basic ingredients of trying to manufacture a product. So that happens in 72, 73. Here we are in 70, summer of 73, and Bushnell has the idea of, hey, let's take another risk, right? Let's go into another entire industry called consumer electronics. And then you've got FCC regulations and all of this. So eventually Atari did, as we know, they partnered with Sears. Sears was phenomenal in terms of Sears provided everything they needed for this. Atari did the manufacturing. Sears sold Atari's Pong under their own moniker of Telegames. So all the hardware, everything is Atari made under that moniker. Eventually, Atari used its own Atari logo on its products as well. So basically, Sears provided the capital in order to produce. They did all the FCC clearance. I think what I really wanted to kind of home in on in telling this story was that the Sears Wish Book must not be overlooked in this narrative. Now, that was an institution unto itself in the US. It's no longer, it doesn't have the same sort of phenomenal sort of impact it used to have. But Sears was a very large scale retail chain. It had department stores across the US. They were often anchors in shopping malls. So there was a recognizable, trusted brand. They also provided like automotive kind of work as well. Um, but the Wish book would come out either late September, every October. And this was sort of the introduction of the holiday shopping season for people in the US, right? All the new products would be shown. And by having Pong appear in there, the national coverage, these were sent free to every household. The national coverage of having Atari's new product placed in the Sears catalog amongst games, sports equipment, all of this, it made sense of it, right? It helped introduce a new product line by way of a brand that is trusted, Sears. And Sears also, in terms of the kind of advertising language in the Wish book, kind of riffed a little bit off of, we've got the inventor of video games, making Pong for us, right? So you have two super brands kind of collaborating together to introduce this new product into the space. And I think by then Atari's name's already established. And now you have Sears as an established name. All of this support allowed the home version of Pong to succeed very well. So the risk was a second risk for Atari. Here we are, we've already established our new product. We're a year into existence. We've made $3 million. Now here's an idea. Let's go on another risky maneuver. But luckily this time, instead of having to go it alone and make it up as they go, they slotted into an institution where all the infrastructure was present.
Professor Pong is famously simple in its visual and gameplay design. How does King Pong show that this simplicity was not a limitation, but actually part of its power in reaching new markets and users?
Yeah, this story also has to go back to computer space. And I think this is something I'm quite proud of in King Pong. I introduced sort of a new argument into an old argument, if you will. When computer space came out, I've already touched on a little bit of this. Um, it didn't change the industry. It didn't force the industry to pivot because a new product type exists, right? Like the idea of playing games on a television screen, it didn't set that world on fire at that point in time. Many players found it confusing. There were five buttons on the interface to press, right? And you're interacting with a TV screen. At that time, you're used to looking down a playfield of pinball and seeing a backglass, right? And our buttons are on the side for pinball. All of a sudden, you've got five placed here. There's a learning curve. You're having to look down at your hands as you adjust your spaceships, for battle. Plus, because it was an attempt from Bushnell and Dabney to translate Space War into a consumer product called Computer Space, well, the name is a little confusing. The name was keeping and maintaining a certain harmony with Nutting's previous product, Computer Quiz. Computer Space was not a computer. If anything, it was an analog version. There was no program in Computer Space. So the name didn't really resonate, Space Combat, Space War, that well. That's another factor. Operators were not trained to make adjustments on televisions. I mean, this was a huge concern. You've got a product that's so new, but the industry itself has to adapt and adopt new skill sets, right? It's in a fiberglass cabinet, very difficult to service, to open it up. And a lot of complaints at the time were that operators used to making adjustments on pinball are kind of going in with screwdrivers and poking around with the printed circuit board, right? So there was a new understanding that had to be cultivated. So these are often kind of the technical reasons that kind of get mentioned. I mentioned a name. I think that moves us into a branding issue, which is entirely different. The industry didn't pivot because there was a new product. Now, what I think, and I think a lot of historians accept this, that Dabney, Bushnell, and of course Alcorn coming in, they learned from their mistakes. And if this game is seen as too complicated, too sophisticated in a negative way, let's say, let's make something that's minimal. Let's make something that is simple for gameplay. First off, the instructions. And I always forget this, but I think it's deposit coin, ball will serve automatically, avoid ball for missing for high score, right? Simple 3 lines of instruction. Um, the knobs that were on the interface, much different than push buttons, right? Knobs are a bit intuitive. We know that we twist knobs, and I kind of take us back in the book to 1972. Where are you turning knobs, right? Your AM, FM car stereo. You're turning knobs on your television to adjust the sound, right? We're familiar with that gesture, of doing this, right? So you have an interface that's recognizable. You have a two-player game. Pinball can be one or two-player. Pong is only two-player. There's two knobs on the interface, nothing else, right? So it's social, it's competitive. By bringing two different people together, they can compete, they can have fun. But I think perhaps the most legible aspect of this is there's a cultural referent that exists, table tennis, ping pong, right? Space War, by 1972, there's probably only a handful of people that have played Space War. Okay, computer space couldn't really connect to that. Pong, people have played ping pong. Anybody can play ping pong. You don't have to be good at ping pong to still have fun playing ping pong. You look at the television inside the Pong cabinet, you can make out there's a line. If I'm watching, I can get a sense of what's happening. There's a line. Okay, there are paddles, and I see a square ball bouncing across. I turn a knob, the paddle goes up. I turn it back, the paddle goes down. I get a good sense of what the gameplay is. That doesn't mean it's easy whatsoever. Pong is not an easy game to play, but I can recognize it. And I think that sense of recognition with minimal instructions and to have a very intuitive type of interface, I think all of these made the game successful.
Professor, you previously wrote Game After an Atari Design. In what ways does King Pong build on or depart from their earlier work, especially in its more explicit focus on business exploits and market development?
So sorry, I'm going to ask you because I've lost track. Which question is this? Because we combined 4 and 8. Sorry to cut in on this.
Yeah, correct. Yeah. So I will jump to the
So
next one. I will jump to the next one.
yeah,
We
because
have
I think
combined. We have
I was
combined.
just
Yeah,
going to
we
kind
have
of say what
combined.
I've already said. Yeah, we
Correct,
can edit
correct.
that bit.
Yeah, I
Okay,
apologize. Okay, sure.
that's okay. That's fine.
Yeah. Professor, the subtitle emphasizes how Atari bounced across markets to make millions. What are one or two specific market expansions or pivot that the book covers, which best illustrate Atari's agility as a young Silicon Valley startup?
Yeah, I'm going to really wear out the metaphor of bounce in my response to you. On one hand, I think it's bouncing across those existing markets, right? Here's a game that can be in arcades, in recreational centers. There's one bounce. Another bounce is bouncing into new markets. It's unheard of that all of a sudden in a hotel or a posh cocktail lounge, we're playing coin-operated games, right? You would have pinball in certain designations. And keep in mind, pinball was illegal in many US cities up until the late 1970s. So there's another legal factor. Pong did not suffer from any of that, right? So it's bouncing into new locations. Then again, Atari bounced into the home, right? So I think these bounces, and this is why the metaphor was so kind of colorful for me. It's like I'm trying to take an attribute of the game and apply it into my subject, right? So now it's bounced into the home, and we know what eventually happens. The Atari VCS hits the market, interchangeable ROM cartridges. That medium of storage is maintained until optical discs are introduced, right? So all of a sudden, gaming is really more located in the home. And that time period, the arcade is still a reigning standard for game types, and so many console games tried to bring what you did in public into the home space. And of course, that model's changed today. But to me, something that excited me a lot in doing this book was that the bounce continues. And I don't mean just bouncing into a little game of Pong for the Apple Watch or playing in a browser, but Pong's bounced into the heritage industry. And what I mean by that is museums. Pong was the part of the first class inducted into the World Video Game Hall of Fame at the Strong National Museum of Play in Rochester, New York. I've been for the last 2 years traveling the world, visiting every single video game museum that I can come across for a Substack I do called Museum Games. And every museum I've gone to, there's a Pong cabinet. There is a plethora of Pong home consoles, plus all of those versions manufactured in other countries. Versions that would have been played in, the former countries of the former Soviet Union that we would have not seen, in Western Europe or in North America, for instance, right? So that's really opened my eyes a great deal that in a way, Pong, and I can't really say Atari in this sense because Atari is a new iteration. Atari SA is the current kind of manifestation of the brand itself, and it's very much a nostalgia brand. But I think we still see Pong active in these spaces. So that's something that's really enamored me. It's that all of a sudden, and this is not like one or two museums. I've been shocked at how many countries I'm sorry, how many countries across Europe and in Asia have museums devoted exclusively to video games. Also, many design, technology, and history museums have also brought games into these spaces. And in all instances, I'm seeing Pong again and again and again, right? So I think that's yet another example of innovation because now stories are told about Pong. It's sort of looked and it's talked about in museums as examples of education, of history, of kind of graphic design history, art history, histories of innovation, histories of business, right? Histories of entrepreneurship, right? It's kind of being used to tell all of these different stories. And I think the high point for me in terms of bouncing into markets was I was in Berlin in the fall of 24, and I wrote about this in King Pong. And I walked past a kind of icons of modern design exhibition hosted by the Volkswagen Group. So, okay, I'm going to go in and see maybe an old Volkswagen I used to own or something like that. I'm going to see examples of Porsche design, right? I walk in and I see all of that. I didn't expect to see Pong there, right? And that really kind of blew me away that at least for Volkswagen, Pong is an example or an icon is it bestowed upon the game of modern design. So dare I say, it's now moving into kind of design circles as well in terms of being examples of kind of 20th century, iconic examples of design.
Professor, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. King Pong, King Pong treats Pong not just as a software, but as a cultural and material object. How
Mhm.
do you use the physical cabinet, its components, and their circulation through bars, arcades, and homes to tell a richer story about technology, design, and capitalism in the 1970s and beyond?
I think I had or I experienced the greatest compliment that anybody's ever given me about 3 weeks ago when I gave a talk at UC Santa Cruz. And a colleague of mine said after the talk, kind of last question, if I may, right? You don't really work on games. And I simply said, thank you for saying that. And here's what I mean by that. My sort of career has been, at least when it comes to video games, has been devoted to kind of exploding the ontology of what a game is. And I'm noted for saying we need to take our head out of the box. And what I mean by that is when it comes to coin op machines, we're focused on the screen. But so much of my questions occur on what's outside of the screen. Why is the screen there? Where is it located? How are we experiencing that, right? And those are questions that I think design history and design studies has helped me kind of at least respond to in certain cases, right? So I've tried to think more of the material conditions of gaming. I've tried to think more of games as artifacts. Game After sort of planted those ideas when I'm excavating junk, rubbish, trash, from a landfill, from a 35-foot pit, taking this stuff up. Um, I think what also sort of helped me think along these lines a lot was with Atari Design, I was studying Atari's different organizational charts over the company's history. And what if I stand back from that process, it's easy, say if I have my little pen, right? And I go, okay, there's what used to be called electrical engineering that probably by around 80 starts to be called software development, right? And here's harnessing and other kind of inside like power supplies and all of that. Here's industrial design, here's graphic design, here's mechanical engineering. There's all of these other sort of design professions that all have an equal stake in shaping that product. But again, we tend to focus on the sexy, here's software development. But I thought from a company's point of view, they've organized all of these different actors, and not to mention manufacturing, the assembly line process, right? They've organized all of these different actors, these different complex components to kind of descend on the shaping of that product. I need to do that. So I think org charts and looking sort of at organizational structures really sort of helped me think a lot more about the different, not just what's rendered on a screen, kind of going under the hood, if you will, like how does the wiring get laid out? Why are you using plywood for the front of the machine and particle board for the side? And I realized so much of my history is about cabinetry, which is really not how we often think about games. And I think the last part to respond to this question was that we can we can see things by looking at objects in ways we might not see otherwise, right? I like to think with and I like to think through objects, and objects often reveal things to me. So, putting your hands on an artifact, I get a sense of what it felt like or what it feels like to play that game. That came in handy when I was writing about the use of these big, heavy trackballs Atari would use for like its games like American football, like NFL. I think it was just called Atari football. And it's a bigger trackball than you would find on Centipede. Well, the difference of this is that Centipede's interface was trying to be more inclusive, trying to welcome kind of women playing the game. So they opted for smaller trackballs so more hands could be accessible in terms of that. Whereas with Atari football, they wanted you to put your back into it. They used what, at least in the US, is referred to as like a duck pin bowling ball. So these kind of smaller balls in a normal size bowling ball, and it's heavy. So the idea of that sport is physical. So they wanted you to kind of really have, put your back into that. So by looking at the kind of physical interaction, there's a story there, right? There's an interesting story that's behind that. And I think that when I often sort of dwell on the history of games, moments that kind of come to my mind, and also through the research that I often do, it always kind of brings kind of games in spaces, plural, but also their physical presence. Like what I'm fascinated about, it's not just that all of a sudden we have Pong playable at home. It's that how does Pong rearrange our domestic spaces? It sits on a coffee table. So when the Magnavox Odyssey came into the home, it's got these long putty cables going across to connect to the TV. Did people trip over those? And was this seen as clutter? Was this a hindrance? I mean, think of the other objects in the early 70s we would have around our TVs. In the US, a TV guide, probably an ashtray, right, on the coffee table, magazines. I thought this whole idea of rethinking domestic experience in space, where video games become part of that routine, part of that place. Again, just playing what's on the screen is not going to allow me to think about this and ask these questions. And I think lastly, the physical presence of games in public places transformed those places for me, just like it did the domestic space. To play at a 7-Eleven convenience store, right? Or to play at a grocery store. We weren't, as a kid, I think back, I wasn't going there to go grocery shopping. That place became a destination because it had Donkey Kong or Star Castles or Moon Patrol or some other coin-op game. So the game became a way of kind of establishing social relationships. And I think lastly, if I was only looking at Pong as what's rendered on the screen, I wouldn't have saw probably the most important ingredient in this story, and that's Andy Cap's Tavern. I would have missed the bar, in other words. And that's huge because Atari knew its market very well by play testing a game at that everyday kind of just average Joe type of bar space, right? So again, thinking about the physical location of games and thinking about their physicality, it just opens up so many more questions. And if I'm only looking at the game, whatever that is itself, I miss all of these other kind of valuable little nuggets that help me tell a story in different ways.
Thank you, Professor Raiford Guin, for this fascinating conversation and for taking us deep into the world of Pong, Atari, and the material leaves of technology. Your
Great.
insights into how a seemingly simple game helps shape entire industries and our everyday relationship with technology have been truly illuminating. To our listeners, if you would like to explore these ideas further, do check out King Pong, How Atari Bounced Across Markets to Make Millions. Until next time, stay curious and keep looking at the objects around you a little more closely. Thank you again,
Mhm.
Professor Raiford, for sharing your time, expertise with us today. This has been a truly
Great.
enlightening. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you. This was really fun. Thank you so much for having me.